Hi, I'm Scott Barton, and this is What I Wish I Knew About AI. What is AI and how can it help you forecast revenue and be more effective when managing complex incentive compensation programs? I want to introduce our guest today, Joel Shapiro. Joel is Chief Analytics Officer at Varicent and Professor of Data Analytics at Northwestern University Kellogg School of Management. Joel's work has been featured globally as a contributor to CNBC, Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and other top journals and publications. Joel, welcome.
Thanks, Scott. Good to be with you.
Joel, we hear all the time about AI. I certainly do, and all the, wonderful things that it's bringing to our lives. In real simple terms, what is artificial intelligence? What is AI?
Yeah, you're right. It's ubiquitous, certainly, both its use and sort of the terminology. So the way that I think about AI is that it essentially is a capability of, let's call it computational sophistication. So it's using really sophisticated computing techniques that allow us to essentially tease out trends. That's really sort of the foundation. I think as we'll talk about it today, that's going to become pretty important. It teases out trends in data and phenomena and so forth so that we can understand what's likely to happen next. That's kind of the key to all of this. AI allows us to take what's happened in the past and make a really good guess about what's happened in the future. And when we know what's likely to happen in the future, we can typically do something to leverage that knowledge. And that's not terribly different from the way that human intelligence actually works, right? It's all about trend identification and processing phenomena so that we can actually do something meaningful with that information. Artificial intelligence is the same thing. We just use computers instead of human brains.
Right, makes sense. So I'm hearing sophisticated trends, making sure that we do things that are meaningful. So what are like good applications for AI? Where does it make sense to use AI? How can companies make good decisions about, investing in this technology?
Yeah. So, I see a lot of companies who decide that they want to be, let's call it data driven, or use advanced analytics, or they want to get into machine learning or AI or whatever you want to call it. A lot of these things are sort of variations on a theme. But oftentimes we see companies that jump right in before they really understand how the analytics or the AI or the machine learning or whatever it is, how it's going to actually help them. And this is sort of hugely problematic, right? I mean, if you're going to invest even a nickel, and AI typically, it doesn't have to be super expensive, but it's going to cost you at least something. You really want to know what problems you're trying to solve, or what questions you're trying to answer, or what opportunities you're trying to address. And so I get really nervous when I see companies say, we want to transform, we want to do our digital transformation because we want to embrace AI. We know that this is important and cutting edge and so forth. And when they sort of lead with the transformation or they lead with the technology, I get a little nervous. And so, my sort of typical spiel when I talk to a company is like, well, tell me about what the problem is that you're trying to solve. And if they can do that, like at a real level of specificity, we want to grow market share, or we want to, retain more customers, or whatever it might be. If they can get specific on it, then I feel pretty good. Okay, good. You got a direction that you're going. But when it's just sort of this vague notion of we want to be more competitive, or vague notions of personalization and customization without more than that, I get nervous, because it all starts with what's your business problem, or your business question, or your business opportunity. And from there, a data strategy, whether it includes AI or not, can flow pretty nicely.
Yeah, makes sense. What problem are we trying to solve? Having worked in sales operations, revenue operations for years, the problem often was around just surprises, and part of the solution was mitigating those surprises. So these are things like, deals that were in the pipeline that, a few days before the end of the quarter, like grew 3 or 5x in value, thereby retiring somebody's annual quota, or, sales campaigns for cross-sell that never really got traction. And people are surprised by this, right? So how can AI be used to mitigate or limit these types of surprises that seem to come up all the time in a revenue operations environment?
Yeah. So look, I mean, AI can be helpful sort of foundationally to what you're talking about, avoiding surprises, is being able to better predict the future. But I don't want to sort of overstate it, because the fact is that sometimes surprises happen. And there are certain things in the world that are unpredictable. There are chance occurrences, there are unfortunate or fortunate accidents, and things change. What AI is really good at is finding some of that typically. So if we know that there are certain trends of things that have happened in the past, certain salespeople working on certain kinds of deals with certain products in certain geographies, and in the past we've seen disproportionately frequently a big deal, come of that when we didn't expect it. AI can be pretty good at teasing that out and saying, hey, in this particular set of circumstances, we're more than likely to see that kind of thing happen again, or we're really unlikely to see a big deal come in, whatever it might be. So because AI is sort of foundationally about prediction, that is almost definitionally helping you to sort of mitigate those unforeseen consequences, or to mitigate those surprises. The thing that sometimes people get challenged with is they get, as I started with, they get a little overly confident with AI. AI can move the needle. It is never perfect, especially when you are talking about social systems. And sales is kind of like the ultimate social system. It's people, and it's people doing things, trying to bring about some well-defined outcome. Doesn't mean that we ever get things like perfect predictions, but what we want with AI is to make things a little bit more predictable than without that computational sophistication.
Right. So it's not going to eliminate the surprises altogether, but it can kind of augment, right, certain pieces of information. I mean, if, the example I gave of the huge deal seemingly coming out of nowhere, we could perhaps see that is the function of a certain type of customer. And
Exactly.
a single rep isn't going to know that, right? Because they don't have access to, all the customers out there necessarily.
Well, and yeah, exactly. And it's this confluence of events. I mean, that's where computational sophistication just kicks human beings' butts, right? I mean, we can spend, we're two pretty smart guys. We can sit there and we can look at data for a pretty long time. Lots of salespeople, lots of different kinds of customers, different points of the year, and different, contexts, whatever it is. And we just can't process information in the same way. So figuring out those trends that say, in this unique context, we're likely to see an uptick of frequency of this big deal come in, we'd have to get pretty lucky to be able to see that. And even if we could see it, we probably wouldn't be all that confident in what we're seeing. And that's why we use machines, because they're really, really good at exactly that.
2 a.m, I'm probably going to miss a few a few details.
There you go.
So in terms of the sales pipeline, and I just think of all the responsibility that typically falls on the part of a rep and the information that he or she has to put into that pipeline. And it seems like a lot of the kind of critique around the quality of the data in a pipeline, ultimately falls on the rep. It's just one person, and they're going to miss things, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So how can sales managers just better manage the pipeline using AI? It's good, really specific in terms of that pipeline piece of it, and its role in the forecast.
Yeah. Look, I mean, so the way that I think about it, when somebody says to me, like, where does something like AI really shine? Broadly speaking, even if we go beyond sales and pipelines and so forth, the way that I tend to think about it is it makes us really efficient. And what I mean by that is we can be really good at customizing what we do, the right things at the right times for the right people to bring about the desired outcomes. And I think that's very true in the pipeline. That's how I think about it. And so the example that I often use goes kind of like this. Imagine that we had an AI model, an AI tool that allowed us to take any given person anywhere within a sales pipeline and come up with let's call it a predicted likelihood that they would actually buy. So a conversion, if you will. And let's just imagine, let's grab 3 of them at random. And let's imagine that one person, according to our AI tool, has a 95% likelihood of buying. So pretty likely to buy. Another person has, let's say, a 50% likelihood of buying. And then another has a 5% likelihood of buying, right? So our AI tells us that with these 3 people, we've got one very likely, one very unlikely, and one in the middle. And I like to ask salespeople and sales leaders, I'll say, look, you've got limited resources, of course. Where do you want to spend your most time? Where do you want to spend your valuable time and resources? If you could only choose one of those 3 prospects to engage with, which one would it be? Just out of curiosity, Scott, which one do you think people mostly tell me that they want to spend their time with? The 95%, the 50, or the 5? Curious what your take is.
Probably the 5.
Well,
Shameful.
Well, I don't know about that. So here, it's funny that I'm glad I asked you that question, because actually what people will do is they'll say to me that they want to spend time with the 95% person. And the reason for that, I think, is kind of straightforward. They say, look, if I've got somebody who really wants to buy, I want to make sure that I'm doing whatever I can to get them across the finish line. Now, the way that I think about it is, look, if you've got somebody who's really likely to buy, you've got to make sure you complete it, but you want a pretty light touch. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is because, look, if I've got somebody very likely to do what I already want, I'm not going to spend, or at least I shouldn't spend, a whole lot of time trying to get them to do what they're already going to do anyway. And typically what I'll tell people is, look, the 5% person might be just too unlikely to buy. It might not be worth your time spending there. Oftentimes we find it's those people in the middle that are sort of on the fence where your time is most well spent. But of course, that risks not closing that deal, spending time. And if you can move someone, let's say, from 50% likely to close to 60% likely to close, people get frustrated and say, oh man, I could have done a little bit of good with that 95% person. However you look at it, the key is, if you start with this foundation of knowing what's likely to happen and to be able to differentiate, if I have 1,000 prospects in my pipeline, AI is going to give me 1,000 different pieces of information about each one of those. And whether you buy into what I said or you have a different philosophy of how you would intervene, the point is AI lets you intervene differentially or differently with different people. You want to intervene with the people who are really unlikely to buy, at least you know who those are. Empirically, you know who those are, as opposed to guessing at it. And so, sort of circling back to what I said before, I think of AI as being, how do you allocate your resources efficiently? It allows you to target individuals. Go in and say, this person is on the fence. I could even test out some initiatives to figure out what's more likely to make them buy or move them along in the pipeline or whatever it is. And that's pretty cool. That's nothing that we've ever been able to do before until we got that very sophisticated computational abilities.
Yeah. And that's why, I find AI just fascinating in this space of, sales performance management, because we're dealing with, the unpredictable behaviors of customers, and also of reps, and just different styles. And, I picked the 5% based on what I see from a lot of sales professionals who really like a good challenge. And, those things that seem like they're going to happen anyway, maybe they'll let them go, but it might not be the best use of their time. And, just knowing, right, from the perspective of a sales manager, where to best focus your resources so that they can be productive and successful is really key.
Well, and that's, well, I was going to say that's actually, so it's a super important point that you make. If you said to me, Joel, you have these 3 prospects and your goal is to close at least one deal, I'd go to the 95% person, of course, because I got to make sure I have that one. But when you start talking about sales management, sales leadership, you're not just looking at that one deal. You want to spread your resources so that, rising tide lifts all boats, whatever, right? I mean, you want to make sure that in the aggregate, you are seeing improvement, putting your resources where they do the most good. And that's where I'd sort of recommend you maybe take it off the 95%, put it to something else. Yeah. But the fewer deals someone works on, potentially, the more they might be likely to be like, I got to close just this one. And I think maybe out of maybe it's a little bit of desperation, maybe it's a little bit of nervousness, maybe it's just a little bit of, self-protection. that they go a little too heavy on the deals that are already likely to close. And that's hard, by the way. It's hard, in my experience, it is hard for leadership and management to tell people how to sort of spread out risk in a way that benefits the organization as a whole, because typically people are incentivized on an individual basis.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and they can be so vested in a particular opportunity that even though it's 5%, they just have a personal mission to make something of it. But with that low of a probability, there's a good chance that they, finish the month or quarter and, they don't really have anything objective to show for it, which is really disappointing. One of the mechanisms that I see used frequently, it's a source of frustration, and that is spiffs. Are you familiar with that? Yeah, the nature of spiffs.
A little bit. Why don't you define it for me, and I'll tell you to define it for the audience, and then I'll pretend that I know what you're talking about. I know a little bit.
Yeah. So this is they're essentially campaigns, right? So these are programs that set outside of the normal sales incentive plan that are designed to focus salespeople's attention on typically a cross-sell campaign. And the thought is, if we didn't put these spiff plans in place, then we're not going to get the focus, because it could be they're not going to generate enough revenue to warrant separate focus. So there's a lot of these spiffs that pop up in a lot of organizations. They might have 15 or 20 of these in a year. And for the people that administer these things, it's painful, because you've got to set up essentially just mini sales compensation plans. And then I think for a lot of business stakeholders, their confidence in the efficacy in these things is really generally waning, right? So if we just step back to what is the business problem here, while we're trying to get focus on cross sells, how can we use AI for something like that, so that we're allocating our resources in a smarter way, not just the people and where they should focus to sell these things, but also, think of all the money that goes into these spiff campaigns. It can be a lot of money. And again, if you're not sure where that money's going, it's not an effective use of the resource.
Well, yeah. So look, there are a lot of different elements of this that I can talk about, but let me just sort of point out a couple of things. So number one, if the idea is to do a better job of cross-selling, I think at this point, because we're measuring so many different things, that people would be pretty foolish not to take advantage of all of those metrics and our ability to be smart about what we measure and how we process it, to shed some insight on what cross-selling opportunities there are. So that's one of the things that AI is great at, and it's actually not that hard for AI to be good at it. It's kind of, not terribly dissimilar from Netflix, that sees that I'm watching a certain TV show, and then they try and cross-sell me something else, right? They have something recommended for me. And while it doesn't work exactly like that with cross-selling products or services or whatever it might be, there's a similarity kind of in mechanism that works. And so I would say, first of all, before you go ahead and craft something like this, make sure it's data informed. And AI can be really good at helping you come up with strategies that are more likely to be successful when it comes to cross-selling. But once you've developed this initiative, once you've developed your spiff, I hear a lot of people who they express frustration that, oh, we've got to do this one-off and we don't even know that it's effective and so forth. But I got to tell you that one of the ways that people succeed with data and with analytics and AI is they run lots and lots of tests regularly. It is one of the keys to being good with analytics, and it becomes fuel for AI. And when I say that they run tests, the always the danger with using that word is that people are like, oh yeah, we run tests all the time. Sometimes when people say that they run tests, what they really mean is that they try new stuff. And they're not particularly deliberate or strategic about how they try it to get information that gives them something meaningful. So that's great that you try new things, but if you're not really deliberate and strategic about how you're measuring things, it's not going to give you a whole lot of information. Maybe you see, oh, this went up, this went down, whatever it is. But the beauty of regular testing of lots of different ideas isn't just we know if it works or not, or we do a little bit of a pilot test before we invest too many resources. What you're doing is constantly, if you do it right, what you're constantly doing is building data. You're going out to customers and you're trying new things and you're measuring whether it works, and that allows you to bring those data. Even if something doesn't work, there's value in bringing in data that fuels AI to tell you how to do things better in other contexts, or the next time you go into that same context. And so, I hear you talking about lots of little one-offs. They're a little bit painful and so forth. And I would hope that a lot of people see that as an opportunity not to stop doing it because it's painful, but how to make regular testing and capturing measures that matter a little bit easier. Because that is just one of the biggest differentiators. When you take places that are really sophisticated with great data, great analytics, great AI, and places that aren't, it's often in their ability to regularly test stuff, learn from it, and implement those learnings.
Right. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is, don't necessarily just stop doing spiffs, but do them in a way that is more intelligent, where we're, collecting and using the data so we get a better idea of what works and what doesn't. And I see a lot of that happen in marketing, the marketing side of the house. I don't see a lot of it in sales in a way that, is really treated more like an experiment or a test, versus I think what comes off as, just kind of a bunch of random campaigns.
Well, and so the problem with the random campaign syndrome, if we can call that a syndrome, the problem with that is that when it tells you something that you don't want to hear, it's very easy to dismiss it because it wasn't particularly rigorous. When it tells you something you want to hear, it's easy to embrace it, and nobody can really chop it down because there's no rigor behind it, right? It's too easy to let it confirm what you want it to, or sort of make the point that you hope it makes. And the whole point of being more rigorous and more analytically driven and using AI is to get some of the politics and the bias out. You can't always do it. It's impossible to get it all out of there, but the whole idea is to let the best ideas win. And some good testing can do that if you're just really deliberate about it. It's important.
It sounds like that could be a good candidate for AI. And just trying to stick with the theme here that we started with around being real specific, as opposed to trying to boil the ocean. The other thing that comes to mind, this will be the last thing I'll ask you about in terms of whether it's a good proposition for AI, is in a company I worked at previously, we go through this issue of responding to situations where the rep was basically resigning. He or she told their sales manager that, look, I've got a great offer, I'm going to leave, but they're kind of leaving the door open, right, to see if the manager's going to respond with more money, or stock or something. And so this set off, right, a series of events, that was called saves, and trying to save the individual. And there are a lot of skeptics in this process, myself being one, who said, I'm not really convinced whatever we do, if it's a big bonus or we give them a bunch of RSUs, that's really going to address the issue of them being disengaged and considering another job. Maybe they stick around for a while, but probably after a while, 15 months or so, they're going to leave. And so my point is, they've reached the point of disengagement, and all we're doing is just responding. So what we attempted to do with data to address this problem is to be more proactive and try to predict, based on a bunch of data, when reps were likely to disengage. And I tell you, just having gone through this, it was a painful exercise. We're using spreadsheets, we're trying to make sense of a bunch of data. I am staying up till 2 a.m. trying to make sense of this stuff. And then, in terms of what the managers got as a tool so they can engage in this process, wasn't particularly user-friendly. There was no dashboard, really. It's just a bunch of spreadsheets. So in a situation like trying to limit churn, be proactive about very expensive and valuable, sales resources, disengaging, getting ahead of that problem, how could AI help in a situation like that?
Yeah, so predicting churn is hard, whether it's customer churn or salesperson churn or other employee churn or whatever it is. It's hard to do, but there are some pretty substantial upsides if you can do it. And again, remember, we're not relying on these models to do it perfectly. We just want it to be at least a little bit better than we could do without those models. And so, if we're talking about identifying I don't know, whatever, you got 10 people in a sales team, 1,000 people, whatever it is, AI can be used to generate like let's call it a risk flag, right? We can think of it again. It was kind of like my prospects converting deal, a set of probabilities from 0% to 100%. Someone's 90% likely to churn, 10% likely to churn, whatever it might be. And so AI is pretty good at looking at all the things that happen to all the different salespeople in all the different contexts, and a big deal comes in or it falls through or whatever it is, and being able to say at any given point in time, the likelihood that someone is going to quit within, I don't know, a 3-month period or whatever it is X%. The beauty of that is when you know that across your entire team, you can actually do some pretty important things with that. Like, one of them is, even if you couldn't save anybody, the fact is, if you have a better sense, if you have a heads up that certain people are going to leave, even if you can't save them, it's pretty nice to be able to know that, right? To make alternate plans. It's also really nice to be able to know which ones you're going to try and save. If you've got somebody who's super unlikely to quit and you've got someone who's more likely to quit, kind of the same thing as before we talked about with allocating your resources to the right prospects. Hey, leave this person alone. They love it. They're doing great. Let's focus our time and effort on this one person who seems to likely be at risk in the near future. And, when you start talking about how do you actually intervene with them, AI can be pretty good if you can sort of empirically tease out what are the factors that are related to someone quitting. Not only can you have advance notice of it and intervene, sometimes it can give you some good ideas of what you could do, if anything. Again, some people, there's probably not a whole lot you could do, but other people, it might be like, oh, if we paid them more, if we, gave them more time off, or whatever it is that we might do, send them a nice bottle of wine, whatever it is, that can all go into sort of our big, suite of intelligence to figure out how do we keep more people, or as I said before, if we can't keep them, at least we know that they're going to leave, which can be valuable in and of itself.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, super cool, very important, I know, for a lot of companies in terms of just, getting ahead of what are those things that tend to disengage people.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is good stuff. I've learned a lot from this, just from the conversation. And, I wish I had known a lot of these things as I was going about, these tasks that are really data intensive and require a lot of mental horsepower. And so I was like, they don't necessarily have to. So this has been great, Joel. The spirit of the series is on the growth mindset, growing and learning. So for you, what is something you wish you knew as you go about, your growth journey?
There's a thing that I mean, it's funny because it's something that I actually know a decent amount about, but when I talk about it, teach about it, think about it, whatever it is, I feel still like I don't have a great grasp of it, and I wish I knew more. And it basically goes to this. I can build pretty darn good model. It's accurate. All the measures of sort of accuracy of an AI model are met and all that kind of stuff. And I know it's a good model. But very often when we're trying to create change in an organization, I see a lot of people who specialize in data who are like, oh, I built a great model and the model speaks for itself. Well, it never does, right? That is not the way people make change in an organization. Fact is that they need to be convinced and influenced and, cajoled sometimes. Models don't speak for themselves. And so I continue to observe a lot of times where good analytics and good insights don't live up to their promise because the people who actually have to act on them just aren't convinced. And so what I wish I knew more about is how people actually make those decisions. And I've talked to people and I've done some observation. I feel like I have some good insight into it, but it's super interesting, right? It's a kind of maybe a combination of behavioral science or maybe behavioral economics. It's a little bit of armchair psychology, I suppose. A lot of things that I don't have any formal training in, but try to read up on. But it's hard because, AI the way that I see it, AI is not meant to replace people. It's meant to supplement their judgment, supplement the business, and make the business decisions better and easier. But at some point, people have to buy into it.
Yeah.
And why don't they?
They don't follow the same logic necessarily in making those decisions, right?
Yeah, I'm still fascinated by that and still think a lot about that. I wish I knew more about it.
Well, it's very aspirational. Thanks for sharing. And again, this has been super, super informative. Just any, last like words of wisdom or, piece of advice that you'd want our listeners to know about.
I guess that the one thing that I would say is I still, especially within the sales domain, I still see a lot of people in organizations who are adhering to rules of thumb, long-standing industry knowledge that sort of they swear by. And those are really good opportunities to actually empirically test whether those things are true. Whether it be someone who says, oh, it's best to really simplify the number of comp plans that we have. Maybe that's true. AI gives you the opportunity to perhaps even create a customized one for each individual. Now, maybe that's overwhelming and ridiculous. Nobody wants to go in that direction. But every time I hear someone say, well, we just know it's true, or that's been true forever, or that's just a good rule of thumb, there's that part of my brain that always goes, oh, I want to test that empirically and see if it's really true. And I guess I'd like to impart that same level of maybe skepticism or curiosity in people, because there's a lot of information out there that can be and is being measured, and some pretty darn good analytics tools that allow us to not take those things at face value and actually test to see if they're really right. So that's kind of a fun way to think about it. I like it. It's sort of always where my head is.
Yeah, well, there you go. And also to the audience, let us know what you wish you knew about, and we'll dive in. Hopefully, subscribe. Like what you heard and watched, if you did indeed like it, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks a lot, Joel.
Thanks, Scott. It's great.